All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We check out impactful theories and discoveries and points of view that are explosive, atomically explosive. But you probably haven't heard of them because they've been suppressed and they are kind of outside of the realm of polite conversation. But not for long. This is our 253rd Bible Decode, sticking with the New Testament and kicking the tires on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, the hypothesis that states that the Roman emperors of the Flavian dynasty are the true authors of the New Testament, written pretty much between, say, 70-something, low to mid-70s AD, all the way up until almost 130, 135 AD. So it was a long psychological operation from the Flavians, the Roman Caesars, from 69 until 96 AD. They wrote those stories, and well, then the whole thing was carried on by family members after the dynasty was over. They had, this is Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, his son, and his younger son, Emperor Domitian. And Titus and Vespasian were both military commanders in the war from 66 to 73 AD against the Jews. So the Romans were fighting the Jews. They had been fighting the Jews for over a century, ever since the Romans took over in Judea in 63 BC. They endured countless uprisings and riots and revolutions and insurrections from the Jews, culminating in this war from 66 to 73 AD, when a few self-proclaimed messiahs rose up and kicked out the king of Judea, Herod Agrippa II, puppet ruler from Rome, sent him back to Rome, where he told Emperor Nero, and Nero sent in General Vespasian. Nero was eventually assassinated, bringing along the Year of the Four Emperors. Three more successive emperors were assassinated in quick fashion to give the call to General Vespasian to be the new emperor. He left to do so and left his son Titus in charge of the war there. And Titus utterly destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. And then finally wore down the rest of the Jews at Masada in 73 AD. So both Titus and Domitian were wounded in this war, and they were really just tired of dealing with the Jews, how high maintenance they were, and how separatist and xenophobic they were, with their chosen people mantra that also underlay all these crazy idiosyncratic rituals, kosher food laws, strictures against graven images, Sabbath on Saturdays. And so they reached into their bag of tricks. And for the Romans, that certainly includes psychological operations, in particular using religion for psychological operations. And so they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who instead of being a military commander was a prince of peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's heavy backpack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, while in the same breath he's overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers outside the temple or in the temple, and castigating the Jewish merchants selling small animals for the sacrifice. So Jesus is taking direct aim at the Roman rituals and traditions, while at the same time being utterly deferential to Rome throughout the Gospels. And then when we get further into the Bible, into the New Testament, we recognize that Paul is even more pro-Roman and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. And this is a clue that was picked up by the authors of the present book here today, called Operation Messiah, by Rosemary Sheldon and Thais Voskuilen. And this book does not delve all the way into the Roman origins hypothesis, only a narrow focus of saying that it's Paul who is the person whose behavior is inexplicable. They somehow are able to kind of rationalize Jesus's behavior as being against Rome, because he was crucified by the Romans, and he did some things that were created chaos within the Roman realm that required law enforcement. But they kind of veer away from what the text actually says, where he doesn't ever do anything against the Romans. Either way, their hypothesis is that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans, and that he faked his conversion on the road to Damascus in order to infiltrate the nascent Jesus movements, particularly the Nazarenes, who had been around before, but now James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter were kind of spearheading this. Now, if you want more thorough evidence about the true authorship of the New Testament, you can watch any or many of my previous Bible Decode videos, where I go into the evidence, but usually give an overview of the most salient points before I get into specific cases. But basically, there is, obviously, we presented the motive, and the method of operation. The Romans were really the only people at all who had the means and the opportunity to do this, given that they had a monopoly on censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire. The Gospels are written in Greek, which is one of the languages that the Caesars spoke in, along with Latin, and not so much in Judea. A little bit of Greek there for the elites, certainly not for too many illiterate fishermen. Now, the direct evidence, though, is more overwhelming, which is that at the same time that the Romans wrote the Gospels, they also wrote a history of this war against the Jews, featuring, Vespasian and Titus, but the book came out under the name of Josephus, or Josephus. His book is called The Jewish War. And when you read Jewish War in conjunction with the Gospels, you will discover many very interesting parallels that go way beyond the realm of coincidence. Michael Menescot's in his 2024 book called Christianity's origin as a Flavian secrecy cult, found over 250 parallels between War of the Jews and just the book of Luke. And he graphed them on a chart, which allowed him to form 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, APTVS, putting a dot in every place where there's a correspondence, with Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. So APTVS, 5 letters in Latin. The Romans signed their name, or at least put their initials on the book of Luke, just so that we would discover it someday. And Joseph Atwill also noted in his 2005 book, Caesar's Messiah, that Jesus' ministry is nothing more than a kind of a parallel of Titus's ministry in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order. And every place they go, they encounter parallel events that are spaced out by exactly 40 years. So there's a ton more evidence beside that. Maybe I'll get into a little of it as we read through this book, Operation Messiah. Right now, we're in the conclusion, and I don't know, the conclusion's been going on for a while, so it's only a matter of time before they wrap it up here. But they're talking about kind of Paul and Jesus here. It is surprising how little we know about the beginnings of Christianity. The single New Testament writer who concerns himself with the experiences of the Jewish believers in Jesus, the Nazarenes, furnishes us with little more than an idealized preface to the career of Paul and the evangelization of the Gentiles. It is clear that James was a figure of outstanding significance, but we learn hardly anything about him from the New Testament. In fact, to a large extent, the information we get about both Jesus and Paul does not come from documents originating from those Judean and Galilean communities which flourished in the formative period of the Nazarenes. We have no documents in primitive Christianity that correspond, for example, to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Only through the study of Jewish history, Roman documents, the writings of the Church Fathers, apocryphal Gospels, and various relics of lost books can we reconstruct the history of Paul's life and career. Incidentally, the Romans wrote a lot of that stuff too. They wrote all of the Church Fathers. They wrote all of the apocryphal books. And then we have Roman documents. Maybe Jewish history might help, but that's the Old Testament, and that's mostly fraudulent for different reasons that we'll get into on this channel eventually. Various relics of lost books might be a good place that we can reconstruct the history of Paul's life and career, or we could use Occam's razor and just say that Paul never existed, and this is fiction, and Jesus never existed, and this is also fiction, because the Romans did all of it. And so they created the character of Paul and Jesus, but maybe they're based on real people. That's certainly a possibility, especially when you do look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the most catastrophic events that had an impact on the survival of this literature and lost traditions was the Jewish struggle with Rome in 66 CE, and the later revolt under Bar Kokhba in 132 CE. Jewish resistance to the domination of the Imperial Romans was the backdrop for the ministries of Jesus and Paul. And no description of this period is worth anything if it does not consider the effect this situation had on the minds of the loyal Jews who believed in Jesus as their Messiah. Or you could turn it around and you can recognize that the Romans wrote the New Testament, and so therefore you can see exactly why they wrote it, because Jewish resistance to the domination of imperial Romans was the backdrop for the ministries of Jesus and Paul. Exactly. Or instead of using the word backdrop, they should have used the reason for the ministries of Jesus and Paul being created by the Romans. The Nazarenes headquartered in Jerusalem mostly perished in the wars. There is a tradition that some escaped and fled across the Jordan. We do not know if this story is true, but in any event, they were only a fraction of the number of Nazarenes in Palestine. At the beginning of the revolt, the Gentiles of Caesarea massacred the Jews who resided there, and within 1 hour are reported to have killed 20,000 of them. Probably getting that from Josephus, who is an incredible exaggerator of numbers, surpassed only by the Old Testament. But the upshot of also of the Roman origins hypothesis, one of many upshots, is that also, so if the Gospels aren't legitimate and they're fiction, well, Josephus is also fiction, or more probably like a basic skeleton of the history being true, and him inserting whatever kind of narrative and details that he wants based on, fulfilling this code to write the APTVS letters and, also the other codes, like such as the order of Titus's military campaign and Jesus's ministry. Other things like fulfilling the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament. He has to write those in there. The most important of which was the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, which is predicted by Jesus, and he says that that is a sign of his second coming, making Titus the second coming of Jesus, which is something that was recognized by theologians all the way up until the 20th century, and then they kind of pushed that one aside. But most theologians up until the 20th century did recognize that Titus was the second coming of Jesus. But now they've got us pointed at this apocalyptic situation. Now that happened back in the day as well, especially in early America and stuff. But that was more of a minority view. Okay, by the time the war was over and the Gospels were written, there was no one around who had known Jesus or Paul. By the time of Mark's Gospel, the Christian attitude toward the Romans is apologetic. Now, you may know that Mark's Gospel was the first one, according to scholars. But it doesn't matter because the Romans wrote all of them. And so obviously the Gospels are going to be apologetic, is what he calls it. So they are really saying that, they emphasize the amount of time involved. There was no one around who had known Jesus or Paul by the time the Gospels were written. And so as a result, this apologetic to the Romans thing had seeped in, or maybe it was there the whole time, or maybe it was written into it as fiction. And so there he says Mark does all he can to disassociate Jesus from Jewish nationalism. So here what they're really doing is, there is no evidence to refute that, as far as I can tell. To refute his his dissociation from Jewish nationalism. Jesus, there is no evidence of it in the Gospels, and so either they are saying that it's implicit, they're assuming it, or maybe they're citing other sources that may indicate that Jesus has some kind of Jewish nationalism. But instead they say Mark does all he can to dissociate Jesus from Jewish nationalism. It's like they're assuming that Jesus has some Jewish nationalism because normal Jews probably would. But this special Jesus doesn't, because the Romans wrote it, not because Mark got into apologetics because he never met Jesus in the first place and is writing 50 years after the so-called events. But it's, more that those events never occurred and this whole thing is propaganda. Okay, the Romans worried constantly about sedition. Especially in the time of Paul, they worried that Christ believers were part of a group involved in Jewish nationalism. The Romans knew the Jews were not all messianic, but the ones who were, they considered to be dangerous. What better way to keep an eye on dangerous revolutionaries than to have someone within the movement not only keeping an eye on their activities, but preaching a message that was counter to the Revolutionary Party line? Or why not just write a story about a, revolutionary who wasn't dangerous, but promised salvation? While on the road, Paul was an antidote to the Nazarenes. In Herod's palace in Caesarea, and once in Rome itself, he could advise the authorities and the emperor on the members of the movement, their activities, their methods, their allies, and their hiding places. Paul tried to keep his followers from participating in any activity that would link them with the Nazarenes. Only later, when Judaism and Christianity definitely parted ways, was there something more to worry about. When Christians who were not Jews refused to burn incense before Caesar's image, then their beliefs became treasonable. I'd like to see the footnote for that, but they don't have one. I'm not familiar with that episode. Only later, when Judaism and Christianity definitively parted ways, was there something more to worry about. When Christians who were not Jews refused to burn incense before Caesar's image, then their beliefs became treasonable. I'd like to know what they're talking about there. Messianism represented the conviction that the existing world order would presently be overthrown, Messianists preached that the empire ruled by Caesar and his legions would pass away. While the dreamers were waiting for the Messiah to arrive, the Romans found it useful to infiltrate such groups in any way they could. Exactly. And so they wrote the Gospels, which would be the most direct way to do it. And the most long-lasting, probably among the most cost-effective, even though when you do read the New Testament, along with Josephus, you recognize that they must have put an incredible amount of work into this thing to get it to the point that they got it, with all the ciphers and code and correspondences in patterns. And you can also, when you do this process, you don't have to believe me. Please go get yourself a copy of Josephus online for free as a PDF and read it along with your Bible. And it's much longer of a text than the New Testament, and so there's but you can learn to spot some of the patterns whenever either the Bible or Josephus kind of goes off on a tangent or kind of drifts into a discussion of something that's not directly relevant. Whenever they use proper names, especially when they repeat them, and whenever they kind of switch names of something, or they're always trying to bring your attention to, this is where you can find a parallel. If it's like there are no words wasted, we're not going off on a tangent. We're delivering you code. We have to tell the story, but then when we're drifting off and into some more colorful and not directly relevant texts, that is where you go looking for the codes. Okay, so, but they never consider that, they say through their agent Paul, a Roman government-friendly departed Jewish Messiah was introduced. So the Romans found it useful to infiltrate such groups in any way they could. But they're right there, but they don't take the next step and say, maybe they wrote some propaganda as well as did it directly through spies and so on, intelligence agents. But it would be more effective even to write it so that it would last throughout time and that they could shape it. And I think this royal family named the Pisos, who were kind of shadow characters within the Flavian dynasty, that it was kind of their mission as a family to write these. And they really wrote these Gospels and all the other books as plays to be performed in front of people. And they, so there were, Arius Piso he played the roles of Jesus. He also played the role of Satan, who never really existed until the Gospels. Satan is also completely fictional. The Satans that appear in the Old Testament, which is only a handful of times, are all humans. They're people who are obstacles or impediments. But the supernatural Satan is the product of the Romans. And he also appears as, there's another character. And so the son, he had 5 sons, I believe, and they mostly played the roles of the apostles. And, they worked out their script in Mark. And then probably also in Matthew, which came out years after Mark did. But then they really wove it all together in the book of Luke. And so that's why the book of Luke has the most parallels, and that they're the best organized, to the point where they actually signed their name on the book of Luke, if you know the code. And this was a long-term project. It lasted all the way until the grandkids. The grandkids were still writing it, and maybe even after that, because the Roman empires kind of gradually morphed into the Roman popes, and they're all in the same family line. And so who knows, the church fathers who were writing in like 2nd and 3rd centuries, according to Abelard Reuchlin, that all of that stuff is from the Flavians or from the Piso family, and also the Apocrypha. Okay, let's finish this up here. Through their agent Paul, a Roman government-friendly departed Jewish Messiah was introduced, who had to be worshipped by perfectly obedient citizens. How ironic that in the end the Paulinists became the victorious wing of the church and survived because they allied themselves with Caesar. Or maybe Caesar allied themselves with them, who they created. We, along with some of his contemporaries, believe Paul gave birth to that movement as a pro-Roman provocateur. All right, that is the end of this book. Now, this book, I believe, it's hard to go through this right now for me, because of just, I'm trying to do a million things, but some of the footnotes here for this this book are, I think, really kind of a gold mine. Could be kind of a gold mine for finding really interesting sources about different interpretations here. I think that going through these sources, you will find that there probably are a lot of scholars out there who are knocking on the door of the Roman origins hypothesis, but just don't open it because they, it takes kind of a leap of thinking. It's kind of another level of thinking to think, oh, maybe they did the whole thing, not just a part of it here, not just part of it there, but that they did the whole thing.